Hi everyone and welcome to this video. In this video we'll talk about fairy tales. I'll give you a brief introduction to fairy tales and their interpretation in the Jungian context. And then I'll interlude a fairy tale that I'll discuss in one of the next videos as a concrete example. Now, as you know, on this channel we talk a lot about the Jungian interpretation of the psyche and now also products of the psyche, as we'll interlude in a minute, being one of the most important sources for Jung's work. Now, if you like this content, if you're interested in more content, please do comment below and tell me what you want to hear about. If you have any specific fairy tales that you want me to interpret on the channel, then please let me know. Now, the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, why fairy tales? So why do we care? Why do we interpret these kinds of things? We want to know about psychology, right? We want to know about what the psyche does and sort of the architecture of the psyche and all these things, self-development and all that. Why do we care about fairy tales? And I want to situate fairy tales in the broader context of the so-called products of the psyche. For Jung, products of the psyche are that which we produce as subjects. So the kind of things that we sort of go out and, let's say, make of the world, if you will. Now, this is very interesting because you can think of the world in this context as something that is out there and that we sort of mold into a structure that, that we then manifest in certain contexts. This may be art, it may be, again, mythology, rituals, fairy tales, again, is one of them. It may even be something like movies, music. All those are for Jung not only responses to the world, but manifestations of the way we see the world. And for Jung, the world and us are essentially conjuncted very closely. Now, so the way we see the world is very closely related to the way we see ourselves. And again, since you can say this mundanely as well, we always only exist at the intersection of the world and ourselves. And for Jung, this is even more specific. We exist as mediators between two realms, the realm of the archetypes, the realm of the heavens, and the realm of reality, that's hell in this metaphorical framework. And we come to be in this sort of liminal space. The products of the psyche are precisely the way we describe the experience within this liminal space for Jung. Now, I made a video on this, sort of us coming to be in this sort of mediation between these three world layers. The video is entitled something like Our Purpose in the World. So do go and check that out. It is quite interesting, therefore, and an integral part of sort of the, let's say, emergence of Jungian thinking or Jungian thought to look at products of the psyche. Fairy tales play, to some extent, a special role, and to some extent we have to sort of, let's say, discount them a little bit, because fairy tales are, let me just write down a timestamp here, sorry. Fairy tales are initially oral stories of, let's say, the people in quotation marks, especially in European fairy tales. You see a large history in folk stories, which are preceded by, they're simply stories that we used to tell each other, let's say, around a campfire. And this opposes them to something like a ritual, like an initiation ritual, which are constrained to a very specific, let's say, privileged group of peoples, and other rituals that are always also constrained to certain holy festivals, which certainly do have their role in the interpretation of the world around us, and specifically how we deal with this world. But again, they are constrained to these sort of specific moments, while fairy tales do have a more general, sort of widespread element to it, and therefore are more, let's say, condensed. Now, when we think about products of the psyche, we want to sort of keep them and use them as archetypal material, so images of the archetypes, again, as Jung would call them, or archetypal images. And we always want to concern ourselves with trying to get a handle on the material as raw as possible, so as original as possible. That's why cave art is a very interesting source, because cave art is extremely old. It's not sort of subjugated by, let's say, continuous interpretations and translations and passing on and rework, like the Bible, for example. The Bible is a great source, but it is has been interpreted many times. It's been rephrased, edited, and so on by many sources. And that, on the one hand, that condenses it to a more, let's say a more archetypal version, because it's passed through so many mouths, if you will. But because of the ideological influences that the church has sort of in coming up with these stories, it would be more interesting to read sort of original biblical text in the original language, let's say before certain councils occurred and certain texts were adapted and changed and omitted potentially. With fairy tales, we do have this chance, especially in the German language, because that I am blessed enough to speak, because you have the Grimm fairy tales that are quite early documentations of oral traditions. Now, the Grimms, I think it was in the 15th century, 16th century. I'm not entirely sure actually from when this was. I don't have it here, unfortunately. It's in the hallway because I was reading it yesterday. So it's not in this room, but it's a very early version. And you can see in this version that it doesn't make sense linguistically to my mind, to the German that I'm speaking. This is not only because of difference of spelling of words, but it's also because sentences are entirely different, because essentially what they did is they just simply wrote down what they heard and what they could uncover in certain folklore sources, and sort of wrote that down as the fairy tales, in quotation marks, that we then co-opted and created the fairy tales that we tell ourselves today, which have not much to do with actually the fairy tales originally written by them. They're brutal, they're very short. I mean, the fairy tale that I'm going to analyze or introduce later and then analyze in another video it's only like it's like 60 words, and because it's so condensed, it's extremely dense. And now what we're concerned with essentially is an interpretation of these products of the psyche in sort of as a to tell us more about or reveal an insight into sort of the archetypal space, so into the layers behind, let's say, behind the layers of the ego. Now, to understand this, and this now brings us to the question, why do we interpret, is we have to understand sort of what is the archetypal space. And to understand what is the archetypal space, we have to briefly introduce sort of the architecture of the psyche that Jung proposed. And again, I talk about this in a lot more depth in other videos, and please go check them out. Again, if you like this content, then please do consider to subscribe as well. I very much appreciate it, and do give this video a like to spread the word to more people and give me positive feedback on this kind of content. Now, why do we interpret? Essentially, the psyche for Jung is built out of two components. You have the ego, which is the central interpreting axiom of your psyche, the so-called subjective core of the psyche. And then you have everything else, which Jung calls the non-ego. Now, the non-ego, again, is split into different components. You have the personal unconscious, which is part of the ego. Now, if you have never heard of the term unconscious, again, do check out my other videos, but briefly speaking, it's that which is sort of split off from the ego because of repression, because of, let's say, the kind of stuff that you don't really want to have told, that you don't really want to tell about yourself, neither to yourself nor to others, the kind of stuff you reject or deny. Or you have to reject or deny precisely for the sake of the stability of the ego as a whole. Now, that's the personal unconscious. The collective unconscious for Jung, we may be less familiar with, is sort of a space where the fundament of all of reality is located as trajectories. Now, this may sound extremely abstract, but essentially what you can think of is the psyche being structured as different cores, like the universe is structured of different planets. Like the psyche is structured in a similar way. I always like to say there's different gravitational cores, and these gravitational cores, these planets, have at their core again a nucleus. So they have nuclei. These planets have nuclei, and these nuclei are what Jung referred to as the archetypes. Now, these archetypes are the kinds of centers around which content that we encounter in the world can cluster, which essentially means that the archetypes determine the landscape of the universe. Now, this is true in the macrocosm, so in the entirety of the world, as it is true in the microcosm, so the reality of the psyche. Now, this is quite interesting for us because the ego, which is the subjective core of the psyche, clouds the access to these sort of to this background, to these nuclei. We don't really see them, we don't know what they are, and most importantly, we don't have a relationship with them, because the ego intends to build a stable framework that we can project into the future as a means of interpretation. And everything that is sort of foreign or alien to this structure is potentially dangerous, because it potentially threatens the ego to sort of break down. Now, the idea of these archetypes, however, is that they still steer the direction that we can unfold in. And there's a constant move or a constant sort of struggle between these two elements of the psyche, between the ego and between these objective cores of the psyche. Now, that is the reason why for Jung prompts us to think or consider this background, these archetypes more and more. And again, I want to sort of, as a brief intervention, the archetypes they're not eternal, as in they can be changed, they can develop, they can evolve by way of sort of us evolving, co-evolving with them. And this is an important point that I do talk about in other videos, so go check them out if you want. Now, the important reason why we want to interpret fairy tales and why we want to deal with such products of the psyche is precisely because we want to learn more about this world, this background of the world, this background that we all exist on, this backdrop that we all sort of perform on. And the axis and these products of the psyche can serve as an access point. They are not the archetypes, they are images of these archetypes. Now, they are what sort of people have told us or told themselves in relationship to their experience of the world, and their experience of the world is precisely an experience of the archetypal space, because, as I pointed out, the archetypes are the fundament of the macrocosm, which is the entire world, and the microcosm, which is ourselves. Now, this is the reason why when we interact with this material, we can get a glimpse at what people over time more and more sort of condensed into very sort of small space in attempting to interpret a reality that we are still encountering today. Additionally, Jung also said that these products of the psyche, many of these products of the psyche, were created in a time where consciousness wasn't as strong. Today, consciousness for Jung is quite strong. Consciousness evolves over time within the sort of lifetime of a human, from childhood over via adolescence to adulthood, and then declining again, hopefully with old age. But it also evolves in the development of the human race, because for Jung, we start off having sort of a less strong consciousness because societies are not as complex. Societies don't demand consciousness to be as strong. And then as societies develop, as the world gets more complex, consciousness gets stronger and stronger in order to navigate this complexity. Now, these products of the psyche, the older they are, the closer they are to a time, their creation is to a time where consciousness was still weaker, had a greater sort of connection, let's say, to this archetypal space, and or perhaps there was a moment or a certain quest where consciousness was specifically cast into the shadows, let's say, and the shadows were attempted to be brought forth, such as is the case in alchemy, for example, such as the case also in certain religious practices and certain ritual practices. Now, how do we interpret these products of the psyche? How do we interpret fairy tales in specific? There's a lot of work done by Marie-Louise von Franz on the interpretation of fairy tales and very specific elements of these fairy tales, the shadow and so on and so forth, which you can read about, you can study. I highly recommend reading Marie-Louise von Franz. If you want specific reading recommendations, there are a couple of options you can have. There's a link in the description below where you can enter your email address, and I'll send you a list, a reading list, essentially tailored to your needs, to your questions, to your specific quests that you have. There's also the opportunity, you can go to my website, and on my website you'll find, the link is also in the description below, you'll find my own books, but you'll also find reading recommendations. They're not as sort of in-depth and not personalized, so if you want, you can also do this on the website. Do leave your email address and I'll send you a list of recommended readings. Now, how do we interpret? Very briefly, again, von Franz describes this much better, but how do we do this? Essentially, you look at a certain content, and you attempt to identify certain symbols. Now, what is a symbol? I'll briefly say this, and I won't go in depth on this topic, but a symbol essentially points towards a hidden reality, something that is real, while a sign simply replaces one meaning for another, and this meaning doesn't necessarily points towards something that is inexplicable, while a symbol clearly points towards something that is inexplicable within the context of normal discourse, by science. Simply something that is not explicable by science can be represented by a symbol. Now, you want to identify that this in segment, let's say, text, structure a text within these symbols, and then what you want to do, and this is the important sort of Jungian notion, is you want to amplify these symbols. So what you want to do there is you essentially want to say, okay, well, then what exactly does this mean? What is the meaning of a bird? What is the meaning of what is the meaning of the number 3 and a triangle? What is the meaning of a cup? And Jung proposes this method of amplification to apply to the interpretation of dreams as well as the interpretation of products of the psyche. Now, Jung doesn't differentiate between a dream and a product of the psyche. In fact, Jung said that, at some point Jung said that everything we do in life is dream. We always dream. We're always dreaming. And in a way, that's probably, it's a very profound statement. But I do recommend you to read Jung's essays on the interpretation of dreams as an introduction on how to interpret products of the psyche as well, because essentially it's the same method, it's the same thing. Now, amplification doesn't only involve you figuring out, oh, what does this mean for me? That is a part of it, certainly free association, that's a part of it. Associating sort of around, attempting to sort of broaden, zoom in, let's say, associate around certain elements, especially in dreams, but then also in these products of the psyche, sort of building a network of potential meanings around it, but then sort of zooming in and looking at the archetypal level. Now, this could mean, for example, that the image of a bird is closely related to other stories where the image of the bird refers to sort of the soul leaving the body. Now, that is why you may have an association here with the sort of a certain archetype of life and death. You have the theme of the soul involved here. And this sort of precisely this mechanism is also a difference between the Freudian interpretation of dreams, and Freud is not really interested in other products of the psyche, so dreams in general, and the Jungian method. Freud would sort of and Lacan specifically, be concerned with associating certain elements and let's say talking around them, discussing them simply freely. And while Jung would specifically say, well, let's look at the historical, let's look at other products of the psyche that sort of relate to this, let's look at interpretations, let's look at meaning, let's look at the symbolic quality of this element. So this is the precise sort of mechanism or the interpretation. Now, how do I practically recommend using fairy tales, and how will I also propose this sort of in the context of this channel? I propose you, again, it depends on the sort of the context that you're in. If you have certain, so let's say, cultural artifacts from your own culture, in your own language, in your own linguistic background, in your mother tongue, interact with them, look at them, read them. It is, you in the end, you deal with your ancestors, and I think that's a very important starting point. Maybe you can in this context, you may have dreams that come up. You may write down your dreams, develop a practice of writing down your dreams, attempt to relate them to what you read. Not because what you read triggered the dream, but because there may be a correlation, and this correlation may be meaningful. And again, that's what synchronicity is about. Attempt to find, to discover in these products of the psyche, something that is related to your own existence, something that's related to your, something that strikes you, something that gives you the shivers, that makes you feel, that has a numinous quality to it. And precisely in these moments, you see that the ego, on a certain level, is challenged. And I think this challenge is key. That is the whole idea of individuation in the end, is to integrate the non-ego into the ego. And whatever it takes for you to get you there, go and explore. And on this channel, I'll make some videos on the Fairytales by the Brothers Grimm. I'll read them in the German original and translate and interpret them sort of live in the videos. Again, like I don't claim that I'm precisely good at interpreting these parts of the psyche, but I know there's a demand for it, and it's a quest for me as well, and it's a quest also, I think, in interaction. I do intend to start a group of sort of an interpretation group, so where we can meet sort of on a regular basis and interpret such products together. Do let me know what you think of such an idea. If you'd be interested in this, leave a comment below. And in general, please do, again, like this video and let me know what you thought in the comments. And thanks a lot for listening. Bye.